Christine Kritzas.
Kritzas, yes.
Christine Kritzas, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, toxic positivity.
That's the topic for today. Yeah. So it's a big topic. It's been, I think, circulating in the media and online for quite some time, much more recently.
Yeah, there's quite a buzz around it, like toxic positivity.
There is a buzz.
Yeah. So how would you define toxic positivity? Like from a psychologist's perspective?
In a nutshell, I would say that toxic positivity is the denial of the human experience. And when we are faced with challenging, difficult situations and we meet it only from a positive mindset, we are being invalidating of our own experiences, and we are pushing aside difficult feelings that need to be felt in order to process what it is that is happening to us. And so from that regard, it becomes toxic.
Okay. How do you see it manifest in people, like in reality?
I would say that it shows up in people in sometimes quite benign ways. It's not always that obvious. And then, of course, our language is something that it will show up in when people say things like, at least. You know, at least you still have X, Y, Z. When someone has experienced a loss, they will often be met with, at least you have this, or at least you have that, or look on the bright side of things,
right.
Or it could have been a lot worse, you know. And in doing that, I think our intention is to try and make the person feel better. Nobody likes to see a loved one in pain. So the first thing you want to do is try and pull them out of that painful situation. And the best way to do that is to highlight the positives, the silver linings, to say, at least you have this and that and the next thing. But when we do that, we are actually being dismissive of what our loved one may be going through. And I say our loved one, but we could also be doing that to ourselves, where our self-talk becomes one of, well, you know, just be positive, it will get better, it's not that bad. And then going on social media and only putting your most curated positive self forward and only using positive hashtags like positive vibes only, hashtag living your best life. So these are all ways that it can start to show up in our lives. And the effect of that is that we move further and further away from vulnerability. And I actually thought about this today, that toxic positivity is a vulnerability blocker.
Why is it important to be vulnerable?
Because vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. And in order to foster deep, meaningful relationships in life, one will need to be vulnerable. And what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is taking interpersonal risks. It is putting yourself out there. It is saying, I don't know. It is telling someone, I love you for the first time. It is all of these things. But what it is not is perfectionism. What it is not is toxic positivity. And so when we are more prone to perfectionistic tendencies, I think we fall in the trap of toxic positivity a lot of the time, because we want the world to see us in the best light. We don't want people to see that we have a dark side, or that we have weaknesses, or that we struggle. And we care so much what people think. And I think in today's culture, I know growing up in, you know, a big fat Greek family, it was often the message of what will the people think, you know? And so that message was so deeply ingrained in us. And so our outlook is other-directedness, people-pleasing behaviors, self-sacrificing tendencies, you know, not wanting people to see us in anything other than a good light. And that feeds this toxic positive culture.
So is toxic positivity a sort of coping mechanism as well, or a poor one?
It is a coping mechanism. It is one because what you are ultimately doing is numbing and avoiding facing those difficult feelings. And when you push them away, you might think you're having a light bulb moment when you say, I'm going to switch all my difficult feelings off. But what you realize is that by switching your difficult feelings off, you are also switching off your capacity to feel the pleasant emotions.
Is that what happens? Is that kind of the reaction of being toxic positive? Like you kind of become apathetic almost, or?
I wouldn't say that you become apathetic. I think you are still, to a certain extent, feeling the difficult feeling. You are still, to a certain extent, experiencing that painful emotion, but you are quick to pull yourself out of it, and you're quick to pull the other person out of it too. And you are quick to go, right, let's shift gears, let's go get an ice cream, or, let's go do something that's going to make us feel better. And as I say that over here, I do also think there's something like a healthy distraction. I do also think that there are times that you do need to go, okay, let's shift this state that we're in. Let's go for a walk. Let's go sit with a friend. Let's go have a coffee. That's a way of shifting the state that you're in. But at the same time, do carve out time to sit with those difficult feelings, because as Carl Jung once said, what you resist will persist. And if you keep pushing those difficult feelings away, they're just going to come back twice as strong. And the intensity of that emotion is going to be a lot more. And the trigger that you're going to feel down the road is going to be even more intense.
Wow. So it seems like there's, number one, huge knock-on effects. And it's almost to the saying of short-term gain, long-term pain.
That's it.
In a sense.
Yeah, I have my personal experience with that. Like I've blocked out grief for years, and then it came back probably 10 or 15 times stronger when it finally just decided to unlock itself in my brain. And it was extremely difficult. So yeah, I definitely relate to that.
Yeah. And
so that's where you see the problem is with toxic positivity, is that you're repressing the negative emotions when it's really important that you actually feel them and come to terms with them.
And I would add to that, Tarek, that we need to move away from this language of negative emotions, of bad feelings.
But that's what they are. They're bad feelings, right?
There's no such thing as a bad feeling, but there is such a thing as a difficult feeling. And so what we're doing is we are labeling it as this is a good feeling, this is a bad feeling. And so when I experience an uncomfortable, difficult sensation in my body, I immediately label it as bad, which then means that I'm not going to face it, I'm going to push it to the side, and I'm rather going to focus on what's positive. So even just the language that we use around feelings can go a long way. And I think difficult feelings get such a bad rap, but they are actually gifts. They are messengers. They come to tell you that something in your life isn't working out, or that something has happened that you need to pay attention to. And so your feelings and these difficult feelings that may come up from time to time actually allow for you to set boundaries, for you to get to know your values, for you to communicate that to people. For example, and I'll give this example because I think it's quite relatable. I'm sure we all have a friend that is often 25 minutes to 30 minutes late for events or for that coffee date.
Yeah.
And every time, they arrive, they make an excuse, and you validate that excuse because you just don't want to get into any conflict with them, and you just want to enjoy the coffee that you're going to have. But you often leave that coffee date feeling irritable, frustrated, annoyed for not having spoken up and said that, that wasn't okay. But if you take that difficult feeling of annoyance or irritation or frustration, what lies underneath it is often a value. And that value is punctuality, respect for time. And so when we sit with a difficult feeling, what lies beneath is the value that we can go, hold on a second, I actually value punctuality. And I'm coming to realize this about myself because every time my friend is late, it really annoys me. And so you get to become more clear about your value system. And on the flip side, you also get to know what your wounds are. Because when something triggers me that badly and I feel so hurt by what that person said or what they did, often underneath that not only lies a value, but there can also be an earlier wound that now needs addressing. So something for us just to remember is that the trigger is often the clue to that wound that you maybe need to face and address as well.
No, I really like that example. I want to go back to a point you made a little bit earlier around labeling feelings. How did this come about? And is this related in any way to kind of positive psychology? So are they related to how toxic positivity is a bit more available nowadays?
So the term, listen to me, toxic. That is toxic. That is toxic. Toxic. The term toxic positivity has actually been around since the 1980s already. It wasn't coined toxic positivity. I think it was toxic unrealistic optimism is what they spoke about it as. So the psychologists in the 1980s spoke about toxic positivity as this unrealistic optimism. But it was more recently that a psychologist came up with the term toxic positivity. And Martin Seligman, who's one of the fathers of positive psychology, in the late 20th century, him and his colleagues tried to shift from this movement where we only focus on mental illnesses and disorders, what is wrong with people, towards their virtues, their strengths. And they came up with the PERMA model, which is the well-being model. And PERMA is an acronym for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. And so focusing on those 5 areas and, honing in those skills and those virtues can lead to a more fulfilling life. And so there was a movement which led towards positive psychology, but now it's almost as though they've taken it to an extreme. And I think social media has tipped it over, right? It has been that tipping point, I think.
How? How did social media exacerbate toxic positivity?
Well, for one, everyone is under some sort of spotlight when you are on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. And so why wouldn't you want to put your best foot forward? Why wouldn't you want to show people the ideal life that you may be living? And who is going to come forward and share that actually I'm not having the best day and that this happened to me and this is my weakness? And so naturally human beings want to put their best foot forward. And there is also the social comparison theory, which states that, we tend to compare ourselves to the likes of others. And so it's not necessarily that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok usage are making people more depressed and anxious. It's not those specific apps that are causing the anxiety and the depression. It is the social comparison element. It is that when I go onto these apps, I am comparing myself to the next person. I am being more critical of my looks, my accomplishments in comparison to the next person. So it's just about understanding the social comparison theory.
So, and essentially, it's not the app, as you were saying, itself, it's how it's being used. And,
for sure. If we use social media for connecting rather than comparing, it can actually be quite healthy in many aspects.
Yeah. So would you say people who, like influencers, there are a lot of influencers who just post pictures of them in like really beautiful places, smiling all the time, with other beautiful people. Do you think that is, would you label that as being toxically positive? Is that a bad thing, what that influencer is doing?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's bad. I would say it's subjective to the person who is on that influencer's account and watching that influencer. Because if you have a strong sense of self, if you know who you are, if you know what your strengths are, if you are grateful for what you have in your life, what that influencer has on their account is not going to affect you the same way that it's going to affect the next person who doesn't have a strong sense of self, who doesn't remember who they are, who isn't grateful for the things that they have in life, who cannot take perspective of the situation. And so they will be more vulnerable to struggling when they are on that person's account. And this is where the argument and the debate comes in around should children have access to social media? Because children are not in the position that we are to have more coping mechanisms in place to deal with these struggles that we may face when it comes to identity and self-esteem. Children haven't 100% established their identity and their self-esteem and their real self. And so they go onto these apps and they may feel that I should be like this, I need to be like that, I shouldn't do this, I should do that. And that in itself can lead to them experiencing difficulties with confidence, and just building that sense of self.
No, it seems like it's definitely because for children or teenagers, it's at that stage of their lives where, the mind is developing, the bodies are developing, and they're plugged into this game of comparative nature that, messes with your head and doesn't allow you, as you said, to cope well. But from going to the point around, the use of social media, I want to dwell on the labeling side. How are we supposed to develop our own self-worth? Where have we gone off the rails?
How can one increase their own self-esteem?
Yeah, especially as it's all tied to social media nowadays. So especially with the young adults, teens, their view of the world is solely through these apps. I'm assuming so.
Switch off the Wi-Fi.
As a parent.
Switch off the Wi-Fi, spend less time online, actually, is what I want to say to you. Spending less time online can actually lead to a happier life because you are less focused on what is out there and more focused on what is in your immediate circle, in your immediate community. And so I think when we go back to the PERMA model of Martin Seligman and we look at these 5 aspects that lead to well-being and happiness, it's not only positive emotion that is a driving force, but it is also engagement that is important. And when you engage with your strengths, you will find yourself in a state of flow. You will find yourself feeling more content in that moment. And so what you want people to realize and to go back to is to think about what their unique strengths are and to start acting on those. And what they have found is in order to increase the set point of happiness, there are 2 factors that one needs to take into account. One is living a life of purpose, on purpose, and focusing on doing things that give you and bring you purpose and that bring you meaning. And the second point is being of service to others. And so when we are generous with our time, with our knowledge, whether it be gifts, whether it be, monetary emotions, it can lead to one feeling happier in life.
Yeah, it's interesting. With the rise of like social media and stuff and like people being positive all the time and you just see positive people everywhere, there's also a rise of body positivity, right? Would you say, and I'm not like, there's obviously fat shaming is really bad, but would you say the recent body positivity movement can be labeled as toxic positivity, or would that be something else? Do you think these people who just feel like they have to show that they're really happy with how they look, is that them trying to cover something up in a toxic way, in a toxically positive way, or is it really genuine happiness with like how they look and them being comfortable with it? Like, is that a dangerous?
I think there's a fine line. In Greek, there's a saying, pan metron ariston, which translated would be, everything in moderation. If you're doing anything in excess, then I'm going to ask you, how is that working for you? Because my concern is the day social media shuts down, what happens to those individuals who only get their positive emotions, self-esteem, their validation through external forces? What happens to those individuals? So it is about cultivating something internally first. It is about building that within yourself. It is about you validating yourself as opposed to you needing it from an external source. And the moment your usage of social media and taking photos is excess to the point that it starts to interfere with your daily functioning, then we've got an issue on hand.
Right. So seeking external validation is a problem.
That's it. Because at some point or another, it's going to start feeling like a bucket with a hole in it.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to fill it.
Yeah.
And today I might need 10 likes, but tomorrow I'm going to feel like 10 likes aren't enough. So my tolerance for that specific thing is
Increasing.
Is going to increase.
Yeah.
Like any addiction. And so it's just never going to feel like I'm enough, like it's enough, and there's this hedonistic, egotistical culture that we find ourselves in, which is all about I, me. And social media does a lot to promote that.
Yeah.
So if it is only about I, me, then what happens when the internet does shut down for a day? Yeah. How do you fill your own cup? How do you fill your own bucket? And if it is that you are constantly seeking that from others, not only social media, but from your loved ones, from your friends, your family, at some point it is going to burden that relationship. At some point it's going to strain that relationship. And at some point you need to be that inner guide. You need to be the one who is able to share with yourself that everything is okay. I'm okay, what I'm doing is good. So at some point you need to coach yourself and you need to be that support to yourself alongside, of course, getting support from others. I think we are happier when we are in community. And I think we need to always remember that
we're social creatures.
We are social creatures. We are wired for socializing and for being around our people. And so, but it mustn't be taken to the extreme of I won't be able to survive if nobody likes what I post today.
No, I really like that. I want to add as well to your point that I think that's why Instagram removed the like count. So maybe that's a step in the right direction. Perhaps, have you aware of that?
You still see it though, right? Can you? Maybe your accounts can choose whether or not.
I think they can. You have the function.
I think I do remember them removing the likes for certain.
Yeah,
I think when it exceeds 10 or more. Yeah. I mean, correct me, please.
No, I think you're right. Yeah.
But I think when it exceeds a certain amount, that they don't show anymore how many people have liked.
Yeah. Okay. It just shows like let's say I put a post. It'll say Tarek liked and others.
That's it.
So it does that now. Now you can go in if you really want and count, but if you're really popular, you're not gonna keep counting.
Okay.
So that's one point I think maybe is in the right direction. The other point I wanted to ask is around this idea of moderation. So, and I'm not just saying this just to be contrarian, but is it a case of people need to, back to your earlier point, share more vulnerable aspects of their life, quote unquote negative, to balance a little bit? How do we achieve that balance? Because isn't that the difficulty?
I think in order for vulnerability to be present, there needs to be trust. There needs to be psychological safety.
Yeah.
And in relationships where there is that psychological safety, people will be more prone to sharing more, to being more vulnerable, but it does require for the person to feel that this relationship is safe enough for me to drop my armor, because the opposite of that vulnerability is that perfectionism. That perfectionism, again, is what leads us to steering away from that. So
yeah,
it's tough though, because with social media, a lot of people that you don't trust, that you don't want to bring your walls down in front of, are watching you or potentially can see you. So that's why people are much more likely to put their best foot forward, as you said, and just show themselves in the best mood and the best places, but not show their vulnerable side, which means there's like a bit of a catch-22 there. So how can social media actually be beneficial for people?